Good morning. This is Professor Benton, and I wanted to give you a little bit of insight into the upcoming exam. The first couple of examinations have been mostly over things that you should really already know. These are just extensions to the work that we did in Accounting 1. However, when we get to exam 3, now we're doing some things that are quite different. And so when you think about what's going to be on the examination, we're going to do some financial statement analysis. We're going to do some cost volume profit relationships and some budgeting. Now, I uploaded three kind of major videos for budgeting. The reason that I stress budgeting is because all of you will be doing it at some level. Either you'll be subject to a budget that somebody else imposes upon you, or you'll be developing budgets. So I would encourage you to look through the budget videos because I think they're going to have importance for you going down the road. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about financial statement analysis, and I'm going to use vertical analysis here to start with, and I'll throw out some horizontal analysis so you can see that as well. But vertical analysis is the type of analysis that you typically see because it's the most useful, I think. And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to compare two periods, in this case, 2019 and 2020. And so what I did was I put together a spreadsheet with some gross sales and net sales and all the other things that would be present typically in an income statement. And so what we want to do now is we want to do the actual vertical analysis. And there's not a whole lot to it in terms of the computation of it. In this case, what you're going to do is you're going to recognize that because this is an income statement and net sales is a primary number, everything will be based upon net sales. So in other words, this 3124 and this 2942, those numbers represent 100%. And so everything else will be a function of this net sales number. So we're going to start out with gross sales, and I'm just going to pop this in here. And so it's going to be equal to this gross sale number divided by, that's represented in Excel by a /, the net sales number. And I'm going to do one more thing here. I'm going to hit my function F4 button because I want this number that's net sales here to be the constant. And so you can see that I have 102.4% of gross sales versus net sales. So now if I just point to this number and double click it, what I'm going to get going down is all of the percentages as they relate to this 3124 number. So as you see, net sales here is 100%. Cost of goods sold is 46%, and as you know, gross profit is the reciprocal of the cost of goods sold. So in this case, it's 54%. And all of the other numbers, again, these are all related to this number right here, to the 3124. So $600,000 divided by 3124 is 19.2% of that number. Okay, so I want to do the same thing over here. And this is going to be equal to this $3 million divided by this number here. And it becomes our constant. So it's F4 to create it as a constant. And this one's 102%. And now if I just point to this little square down at the lower right-hand corner and double click it, what I can do then is get all of my numbers going forward. Now I realize that probably I need to clean this up just a little bit so it's easier to recognize. So I'm going to come through here and I'm going to click on this cell, hit my control button, this cell, this cell, this cell, this cell, and this cell. And I'm going to put a single underline under those cells. And then I'm going to come down here, hit this cell and this cell. I'm going to come up here and put a top and bottom double border on this one. But that's just cleaning it up in terms of the aesthetics of it. We're really not that concerned at this point about the aesthetics. What we're looking for are these relationships. So I'm going to be looking at 2019 versus 2020, and I'm just going to be looking at my percentages going forward. So I did a little bit better on sales. I did worse on sales discounts and allowances. In other words, these represent allowances that I had to give for substandard product, or they represent discounts that I gave for to make sure I can move the product out. Then sales returns, of course, those are down a little bit, so that's good. That means that even though I gave more allowances out, I received fewer returns, 1.1% versus 0.8%. And those are the kind of analyses that I'd be doing going forward. I don't know why that didn't take. That's kind of weird. Here we go. All right, so looking down through here, everything again is a matter of looking at your percentages to see whether you're doing better or worse. So just looking here, I had a 47.5% cost of goods sold in the previous year, and this year it's 46%, so I've done better. That would mean, of course, that if I did better on the cost of goods sold, I would also automatically have done better on gross profit. And if I follow this kind of down, I see that there's not a whole lot of difference, 14.3 versus 14.5%. But what I would do when I was analyzing these things is I would go through and I would look for any major differences. And of course, you're always going to talk about these two, cost of goods sold and gross profit, as they are so important. But it looks like here on operating expenses, I was able to reduce it a little bit. Selling expenses, reduce that a little bit. And the same thing true for general and administrative expenses. And basically, because I treated those as fixed costs, meaning that they were the same period to period, they would automatically be lower because I have a higher net sales number. And that's an important thing to consider when you think about cost volume profit relationships, which we're going to go to next. Before we do, though, I'm going to just make a couple of extra columns here. And I'm going to show you how vertical analysis would, how horizontal analysis would work. So I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to change my column width to 15. And so if I were doing a horizontal analysis, and I'll go all the way over here so that you can see, I'm going to have my base year, which is this, and this is my current year, but everything will be based on the base year. So when I look at it, it'll be something like this. It'll be equal to this number minus the new number, the old number, divided by the old number. And I'm going to change these to percentages, and I'll just come through here and actually change the whole thing to percentages and give it maybe an extra decimal place. And then what I'm going to do is just, again, I'm just going to go down through here and look at all my changes. So to me now, I'm not sure that horizontal analysis explains as much, mainly because if you notice here, I've got several zeros, so nothing really changed in either one of these. And the reason is because this guy here didn't change because I assumed them to be fixed. Now that probably wouldn't be true in the real world, but it was at least true for this particular example. So it's very easy to do these analyses, I mean, in terms of the actual computation. But the real work comes in trying to discover why certain things changed the way that they did. But the actual, for your purposes, we're not asking you to do a whole lot of analysis here. It's simply, you're simply being asked to make the computation. So again, with the vertical analysis, net sales is always going to be the leading number that you're working with. It'll always be 100%, as you can see in both examples. And everything else is simply a percentage of that net sales number, whichever one you're looking at. And then you're going to make the comparison of this year versus the previous year. And you could do that over any number of years that you wanted to do it. But anyway, that's just a brief look at vertical and horizontal analysis. Excuse me. More importantly, I think for us right now, we want to look at cost volume profit relationships, and they are so incredibly important. And for this examination as well, I'm guessing that about 40% or better of your examination is going to be in cost volume profit relationships. That's how important it is. You also want to take a look at the high-low method. I could have used regression to make a determination of how much the variable costs were in a situation where you don't know the split between variable costs and fixed costs. But I chose the high-low method because it's easiest to do, and some of you may not yet have had your statistics course, so you may not be all that familiar with regression. The high-low method, simply what you're doing is you're taking the high production and the high cost, and you're subtracting from that the low production and the low cost. And then when you divide that out, what you're going to get is your variable cost per unit. So if you multiply that variable cost per unit times the number of units provided, that'll give you an amount. The difference between that and your total cost is going to be your fixed cost. So once you've established what the variable cost per unit is, it's very simple to then compute what your fixed cost is and do an income statement. But I do encourage you to look at the high-low method, since that's the one that I'm stressing for the examination. Okay, let's take a look at these cost volume profit relationships. And I'm comparing two companies here, company one and company two. Your book refers to the average selling price per unit and the average variable cost, and that's really a misnomer. It's a misnomer because we would never look simply at the average. And I'm going to give you a quickie example here. If I had 1,000 units that I'm selling for $1,000, and let me get rid of let's just make this dollars here. So I have 1,000 units that I'm selling for $1,000, and then I have 4,000 units that I'm selling for $500. And so if I did a simple average, I would take 1,000 plus 500, get 1,500, and I would arrive at 750 when I divide by 2. But you see, that would be completely false in the way that you would actually do it. You would actually weight these averages. So if I took this times this times this, and did the same thing for the next one, and now I get a total of 3,000, or 3 million, I should say. And if I were to take that 3 million and divide it by the total number of units produced, which is 5,000, you notice now that the actual weighted average selling price is 600 versus 750. Now, that could be a little bit of an absurd example, but it may not be either. So the whole point being here that if I were using this in my calculations versus this true one, then my calculations would be worthless. Okay, so when your book says average, what they really mean is weighted average. Okay, All right, so the first thing we have to do is we have to calculate the contribution margin, which is simply the selling price per unit minus the variable cost. So this is equal to this minus this. Now, that's 300, the contribution margin is 300 for this one, and just looking at this one is going to be around 250. So this minus this for company two will give us a $250 contribution margin. Now, I've put down here a couple of other things here. I put the fixed cost down here for both items, for both companies, and the profit requirement. Now, when you start out thinking about this, you'll be thinking only about these fixed costs and you won't be thinking about your profit requirement. But as we all know, you wouldn't really run a business without having some indication or some thinking about what profitability you have to have. So if we want to look at break even in this scenario, what we would do is include the profit requirement. Now, break even is very simple. It is your fixed cost, and in this case, any profit requirement over your contribution margin, which is right here. Okay, so if I'm going to come over here, I'm going to make these calculations for you. So 90,000 plus 100,000, that is that's going to be your numerator, okay? And your denominator in this case is your contribution margin. This is going to give us the number of units that we have to produce. So it's simply equal to this right here. And if I divide one by the other, what I'm going to get is 633 units that I'm going to have to produce. Now I'm going to change this to dollars, and I mean to just a plain number. And the reason is that I'm not going to be able to produce a third of a unit. I mean, I'm not going to be able to sell a third of a unit. You're not going to buy a third of a unit, right? So I'm going to get rid of my decimals here, and it'll turn into 633. Now, when we make our multiplication out, when we do that, it's going to be slightly off because break even is actually 633.33 units, obviously. Okay. But now let's just go ahead and apply this 633 here to our sales. If our sales dollar is equal to 650, and the number that we need to break even is 633. If I multiply one times the other, what I'm going to get, and I'll get rid of my decimals again. Oops, wrong way. What I'm going to get is a sales number of 411,450. Now, if I now look at the variable cost, which is equal to this number right here, times the units that I have to produce at break even, 633, that gives me my variable cost. My contribution margin is always going to be the difference between your sales and your variable cost. So it's equal to this number minus this number. My fixed costs, we know here, are 90,000. And so if I now take this number minus this number, what I'm going to get is 99,783. And again, that's different from this 100,000 only by the fact that break even is 0.33, and I didn't include the 0.33. And again, the reason I wouldn't is because you couldn't sell a third of a unit of anything, okay? And I probably should have worked it out a little bit better so I didn't wind up with these kind of small differences. But if you were to take Each one of these and multiply it out by 633.33, it's going to give you back this 100,000 as the profit requirement. Okay, and if I look it up here, if I look at the break even then in dollars, it's going to be this number right here, the 411,450. Now, the way that we're going to prove that, the way that we would prove that is by looking at your contribution margin here of 300 and dividing it by this number to get your contribution margin percent. So it's equal to this number divided by this number. And so 46%, and if I may need to expand that one more decimal to see. So it's actually 46.2%. Okay, so if I were to divide these two numbers, the total of these two numbers, or the sum of these two numbers, by this number, let's see what I get. So it's equal to this number, which is our fixed cost, plus this number, which is our profit requirement, divided by this number. You notice I get 411,666.67. Well, again, that's different from this number only because we have, if I were to expand that a little bit, you see I got that 633.33, and I can't sell a third of a unit. So I've got a little bit of a difference here, and that's totally the responsibility of this being a decimal number. If it were a whole number, I wouldn't have that situation. Okay? All right. So that gives you that one. And if we did this next one, we're going to wind up with a very similar computation here. I want to see what the number of units is that I need to break even, given that I have a fixed cost of this, a profit requirement of this, and a contribution margin of this. Okay, so again, if I add this plus this, I'll just do that in my head, it's 140,000. And here, let me get some decimals in here. My contribution margin here in per unit is $250. And I'll just point to that number. And so therefore, if I divide this by this, I'm going to get the number of units that I need to break even. Now that assumes I'm breaking even with a profit requirement of 80,000. Now this one worked out pretty well because it's even number. Okay, so when I multiply this back, coming back for my income statement, I've got now 560 units. So if I equal 560 units times $550 gives me 308,000, and I'm gonna come down here and put in a decimal so that you can see this a little bit easier. And so now if I take my variable cost, which is equal to, again, 560 units times my $300 in variable costs per unit, I get that. If I subtract one from the other, in other words, this minus this, I get 140,000. And you can see just by looking here, that's that 140,000. My fixed costs are 60,000. And therefore, if I subtract one from the other, I get the $80,000 worth of profit requirement that I have. Okay? Now, if I were trying to break even without a profit requirement, all I would do is take these numbers off. I'd still do it the same way. I take 90,000 in fixed costs divided by the 300. I take 60,000 in fixed costs divided by the 250. And if I did that, I'm going to come out with my break even before consideration of a profit requirement, but I wanted to put the profit requirement in because I know that they're going to be on your examination. All you're going to do with profit requirement is treat it like it's another fixed cost. And if you do that, then you're going to be able to calculate all of these problems that you need to calculate. Now, I want to do one more thing here. When I come down here, I want to show you just how these costs work. When you have a fixed cost, it's like a salary, okay? And so if a salary is $60,000 a year and you are supervising 10 people, then that's 6,000 per person. But if I double the number of people that I'm supervising from 10 to 20, now it's only 3,000 per person. So if I'm looking at fixed cost, and let me just grab a shape here. If I'm looking at fixed costs, as my volume increases, my fixed cost decreases. Okay? If I look at variable costs, now variable costs would be like, let's just say that I manufacture a cup, okay? And every time I manufacture a cup, it's a plastic cup in this case, it costs me $1.50 in materials, okay? $1.50 in materials. So when I think about that $1.50 in materials, if I make one, it costs me $1.50. If I make two, it's $3. If I make four, it's $6, and so forth. So if I were to look at the variable cost per unit, and let me see if I can grab another shape here. If I do that, then the variable cost, well, it's not doing the right thing for me for some reason or another. Shape. I want to insert a shape. There we go. It's going to look like that. Because the more units I produce at $1.50 per unit, the higher my cost is going to be. So on a per unit basis, the greater the volume, the less the fixed cost per unit. And on a variable cost basis, the greater the volume, the more the total cost is, and the cost itself, the variable cost itself, it actually looks more like something like this. If I look at the variable cost, it looks kind of like this. In other words, this is at $1.50. So it doesn't change. It's always at $1.50. Okay. But if I produce two of them, now I have $3 and so forth. So the total cost goes up. The variable cost per unit is constant. Okay. In the case of fixed costs, and these are fixed costs, as your fixed cost volume rises, and if I look at this on the basis of, if I were just to look at this as on the basis of a chart, for example. Well, I'm going to do it like this, I guess. And if I were creating the chart here and looking at this, you can see that this is your variable cost, total variable cost. This is your variable cost per unit. This is your fixed cost per unit. Because they're going down as your volume increases, okay? Then this is volume down here, right? And this is cost up this way. So, yeah, doesn't look right, does it? Let's do this. Let's align this thing so it looks different, I guess. So that's your cost, okay? And I probably should center it, I guess, so it's not down there at the bottom. Let's put it in the center. Now it looks more like a real chart, okay? So you have volume along the X, you have along the Y-axis, you have cost, okay? So now we have total variable cost going up as your volume goes up. You have fixed cost per unit dropping as your volume goes up. You have variable cost per unit constant because it never changes. Okay, and so that's kind of what this thing looks like. Now, the interesting part is that once you hit your break-even point, and this is a critical element of cost volume profit relationships, once you hit your break-even, every product that you sell beyond break-even, you make your contribution margin. So in the first instance that we looked at up here, once I hit this, once I hit this 411,450, now I'm including the profit in there. Once I hit this, every time I sell a product, I'm going to make this every single time. So if I sell one, I'm going to make 300 bucks. If I sell two, I'll make 600 and so forth. And over here, I'll make 250 every time I sell one beyond break even. So those are critical components. I urge you to take some time and walk through cost volume profit relationships again, because they're very important to you going forward, not just for this class. Cost volume profit relationships, if you understand how they work, then you're able to do contribution pricing. So for example, once I have my break even, let's just take a practical example here. Let's look at this guy, okay? Now, the normal selling price here is $550. Once I hit the 308,000 units, or $308,000 worth of sales, or the, what was it, 560 units, once I hit that, every unit that I sell beyond 560 units, I make this, okay? So if somebody says to me, look, and let's assume for a moment that I've already hit my 560 units. I'd like to buy another 100 units, but if I buy that many, I don't want to pay but $525 a unit. Okay? And what you would say then is, okay, because if I think about this, instead of making 250, because I'm only getting 525, I'm still going to make $225 a unit. So if I take 100 units times $225, that's $22,500 that I'm going to make. So it's really an important concept. Just remember, once you hit break even, you make the contribution margin every single unit that you sell. Okay, well, those are going to be hit hard and often, the cost volume profit relationships. And this guy, I will leave you to look at the budget videos that I've produced for you, because budgeting is probably 40% of the exam. Cost volume profit is going to be another 40%, 45%, and financial analysis 10 to 15%, or I should say 15 to 20% of your examination. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you later on. If you have any questions, give me a holler, and I'll be glad to answer them.